Alrighty, well, welcome back. I think we're going to get started as usual. We'll have people trickling in over the next couple of minutes, but I'm glad to see we have a quorum here. It's been a pleasure to have this wildfire seminar series. We have our final talk next week, talking about Stanford's very own wildfire plan. So I encourage you to attend that event. And as is my practice, I have to again encourage you in your sphere of influence to let students and postdocs be aware of our upcoming Wildfire Challenge. We have a class associated with it, students can take for credit, but we have a great event planned for spring quarter with some of the speakers you've heard this quarter being mentors. So I encourage you to, if you're a student, obviously, please participate. But if you are a staff or faculty member, please encourage those in your spheres to check out this great opportunity. But this seminar series has been awesome, and I am incredibly pleased and happy that we have our very own alum, Rebecca Miller, here to come back into our fold, at least for an hour today, to talk a little bit about what she's been doing. I have to say that Rebecca is one of the people that taught me a lot about wildfires over the last few years. She is a postdoctoral scholar now. She left Stanford, is now a postdoctoral scholar with the West on Fire project at the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West. As I noted, she completed her PhD at Stanford in the interdisciplinary program in environment and resources, as EIPR, for those of you who like shorthands. Her research covers a whole vast array of things, including the impact of recent wildfires on policies and communities in California. But you get a two for today. She has her cohort, Andy Kampfschultz, I hope I got the name pronounced right, who's a first-year PhD student at USC, working in the Spatial Sciences Institute, researching the intersection of population health and spatial sciences. I'm really excited to hear what they're going to talk about today related to Firewise communities, which is a grassroots effort, which I'm sure many of you will find very interesting. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Andy and Rebecca. Thank you for being here, Rebecca and Andy.
Our pleasure. And Derek, it looks like Placer County got locked out. Is anybody here from Placer County? Just checking. Anybody? Seems
yes,
like
I'm on.
Oh,
yep,
good.
please.
Okay, at least somebody was able to join. So I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, I'm not sure why Jane couldn't get in. If you could get in, I don't know what's happening. It's probably some technical issue that I can't figure out with Zoom. But
well, I'm just glad that somebody can join in. All right, so thanks so much for this invitation. I'm really excited to share some of the fantastic work that I'm mostly going to say Andy has been doing with all of the spatial science work that he's done, but I'm with the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West, and Andy's with the Spatial Sciences Institute. We're really excited to talk to you about Firewise sites in California, from the very first Firewise sites when they were established in 2005 in the state, all the way to December of last year. So this is fairly current that we're showing you. So I'll give you a little bit of introduction and background to Firewise for those who might not be familiar with the program. Firewise USA is a grassroots wildfire preparedness program run by the National Fire Protection Association, or the NFPA. Firewise is probably the largest wildfire preparedness program, certainly in terms of grassroots fire preparedness across the country. There's about 5,000 Firewise sites around the United States, though I will say that California has the most, with 500 sites. So about 10% of all the Firewise sites in the country are located in California. And of course, that's going to be the focus of what we'll be talking about today, is those Firewise sites in California. And to be recognized as a Firewise site, communities have to do 5 primary steps. The first is they have to create a board within the community, and they have to determine how big that site is actually going to be. So they have to make a border around the proposed homes that will be included in the Firewise site. The second thing they have to do is they have to work with their local fire department to obtain a written wildfire risk assessment, identifying the areas of the highest risk and the highest hazard. And then following up on that, the third thing they have to do is develop an action plan prioritizing specific risk reduction projects. You've identified the areas of the biggest risk. then you have to come up with a plan for how you're going to address that risk. The fourth thing that these sites have to do is host outreach events and work towards wildfire risk reduction. This often takes the form of various educational events, and we'll get to some of that a little bit later in the presentation. And then they actually track their hours and their financial investments, which is really helpful from a data perspective, because we have, in some cases, decades of tracking of how much money these communities have spent to protect themselves from wildfires. Now, to remain in good standing each year, Firewise sites have to renew their applications with the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. And to do that, you have to host at least one event every year, and you have to dedicate at least one volunteer hour, or the monetary equivalent of about $25 per dwelling unit, towards wildfire mitigation. So just to make it clear, if you have, let's say, 8 homes in your Firewise site, because they actually can be that small, they can range from 8 to 2,500 homes in a single Firewise site. So if you have 8 homes, you have to have one event every year, and you need to be investing at least $200 per year in wildfire mitigation, or a volunteer equivalent. So that might not necessarily mean hiring somebody to do your chipping or to clean out your gutters. It might mean you doing that yourself and counting that time towards volunteer work hours. Now, there's a lot of benefits to participating in Firewise as this national program. These include improved community safety because you are working to reduce your wildfire risk. There's also discounted homeowners insurance. USA offers this across, I believe, 14 states in the country for Firewise site participants, so homes that are in an active Firewise site. But in California, there's, I want to say, 13 or 14 other homeowners insurance companies that will also provide discounts if you are in an active Firewise site, because it's an indication that you are taking significant steps to reducing that risk and thus reducing the risk to the insurance company itself. And then another benefit of participating in Firewise is you get more access to funding and assistance. You're an organized group of homeowners who are working together to reduce your wildfire risk. In fact, in Marin, the recent JPA that was going to provide wildfire funding and wildfire preparedness funding has a special provision specifically to provide funding for Firewise sites in recognition of the important role that Firewise sites can play in reducing overall risk, and particularly structural risk. Now, Firewise activities typically involved traditional structure protection efforts, home hardening and defensible space. I'm pretty sure that most people on this call are familiar with home hardening and defensible space, but the idea is for defensible space to create a buffer zone around the structure to prevent a fire from having a direct path right to your front door. It involves fire-resistant landscaping, so making sure that you don't have flammable vegetation, again, right next to your property, and home hardening, using fire-resistant building materials to protect your home, whether that's a fire-resistant roof or eaves or deck or siding. All of these are designed to reduce the likelihood of structure ignition. But as we know, it's not enough to just protect your own home. You need to be working together as a neighborhood to improve community wildfire preparedness. And this really is at the root of the Firewise USA program. That working together to get up to that 100 feet of defensible space is necessary because a lot of jurisdictions and boundaries and homeowners' properties might intersect. And so working with your neighbor to ensure collective wildfire protection is going to be the most effective way to reduce that risk. And in the cases when Firewise communities do come up against fire, there have had successes. So this is from the Falls Creek fire, I want to say in 2016 in Durango, or the Falls Creek community, and the 416 fire, I believe, in Durango, Colorado. This is a Firewise site that worked to reduce its wildfire risk. And they actually successfully protected every single structure in the Firewise site because every resident was fully invested in it. In fact, the fire department actually used the Firewise site as a home base to fight the fire, thus being able to protect the structures in the community and also to protect themselves because the community in this Firewise site had done such a great job with their structure mitigation for both defensible space and also for home hardening. So it really does work when you really invest in these Firewise principles on a widespread basis. Now, there's a lot of reasons why residents will act to reduce their wildfire risk. Most common of these often include prior exposure to a wildfire. disposable income, so you have the capacity and the ability to spend money to reduce that risk. You understand the structural risks of your own building. And you also believe generally that mitigation works, that replacing your roof with a wildfire resistant roof is going to improve the structure's protection and ability to survive and withstand a wildfire. But that doesn't mean that everybody pursues these mitigation actions equally. Prior research demonstrates that wildfire mitigation actions are a lot more common among residents who are wealthy, older, white, and well-educated. And this is going to come into play later on in our presentation. The Firewise sites generally include residents who have these 4 characteristics. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, California has 500 active Firewise sites, more than any other site in the country. And you might notice that what started as a fairly flat trend line has really shot up over recent years. Of course, there's been pretty severe wildfires in California over the past couple of years, and that's been reflected in response to these fires by the increase that we see in terms of the number of active Firewise sites in the country. So this prompts our research questions. First, we want to know, how has participation in Firewise USA changed between 2005 and 2021? Firewise program started in 2005, so through the whole period in California. We wanted to understand what was the influence of underlying fire hazard using the fire hazard severity zone maps and proximity to prior wildfires on the creation of new Firewise sites. So what might be influencing homeowners' decisions to create a new site? And then we also wanted to understand, what are the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of Firewise sites? So I'll be talking about that first research question, and then Andy's going to take over to talk about the second and third research questions. So jumping into these general trends on Firewise participation in California over the last, since its inception. At the moment, about 400,000 people, or about 1% of residents in the state of California, currently live in a recognized Firewise site. This is the cumulative number of residents over time. And you can see that this chart has seen a really big uptick, again, as more people and more communities are starting Firewise sites. So it's about 1% of the population. And it's also just over 1% of all the households in California. So more than 160,000 households in California are on a recognized Firewise site. And over this entire period from 2005 to 2021, residents have invested more than $190 million in wildfire mitigation through the Firewise program since 2005. Though again, a large portion of that could be reflected by volunteer hours, in which people are spending an hour working on reducing vegetation around their home, and that counts for $25 as Firewise counts it. And so it may not be exactly writing a check for $190 million, but cumulatively these sites have invested this much money over time, which is a pretty significant investment in wildfire preparedness. These are the Firewise sites in California. This is a map of all of the Firewise sites in the state. And Andy's used some spatial clustering to identify 4 main areas that we'll be talking about today, sharing some regional trends. We've identified 4 primary areas. The first in Northern California, shown with the yellow dots. The second in the Sierras, shown with the blue dots. The third in the Bay Area, depicted by the red dots. And then finally, the fourth in Southern California, shown in those greenish gray dots. You might notice that the Sierras and the Bay Area have the most Firewise sites, and a lot of them are actually clustered right on top of each other. If you look, you can see my mouse. There's a whole bunch right here. They're all right on top of each other, and the same is true in the Bay Area as well. Now, Firewise sites tend to learn about the Firewise program primarily through local fire organizations, primarily through the Fire Safe Council or their local fire department, indicating the value of peer-to-peer or organization to community communication when learning about the Firewise sites. And in addition, Firewise sites, when they actually conduct various activities that they have to do to remain active in the program, those often reflect educational activities rather than mitigation activities or preparedness activities. So over here, I've highlighted the more educational activities in this blue color that you see here, and more of the mitigation activities in the yellow color here. This is looking at the activities of all the Firewise sites that were conducted in 2021, so it's the most recent information that we have. Again, 500 sites total. You might notice that the yellow bars are a little bit smaller than most of the blue bars, which indicates a real emphasis on educational activities conducted by the sites rather than on actual mitigation activities. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Andy. Andy, did you manage to get the presentation, or am I going to be flipping slides for you?
I managed to get it, but the formatting is all out of whack.
Okay,
So...
well, I will just flip slides for you, no problem. So you just tell me when.
Okay. All right, great. All right, well, yeah, we can go to the next slide here. And we'll talk about the methods used to assess the latter two research questions, mainly the influence of underlying fire hazard and proximity to prior wildfires in creating Firewise sites, and then the general demographics of areas containing Firewise sites. So in general, just talking about the data used for this to kind of give you a context of what we're working with. So the data containing information around the Firewise site as a specific lat-long centroid, so just a point, and we saw that with the California map earlier with all the points across California indicating Firewise sites. So we have those, and additional information attributed to those points, like when they were approved and their funding and that sort of a thing. Beyond the Firewise data, we were fortunate to get some very useful data from CAL FIRE on fire hazard severity zones, which was very helpful in understanding the risk around Firewise sites. And then CAL FIRE also was able to provide us with historical wildfire perimeter data going all the way back to 1990, actually, which was quite a lot of data. So the general approach in assessing wildfire risk and proximity to wildfires was to, first we clustered the sites into two groups to kind of look at differences between those clusters, right? And then that was just a simple like spatial clustering of KNN clustering, just trying to reduce the area. And it very neatly worked out to have a Northern California, Sierra, the Bay Area, and a Southern California cluster. And then for each site within those clusters, performing just a simple buffer analysis of the environment around those. So from each site, calculating, a 1 kilometer buffer, 5 kilometer buffers, 20 kilometer buffers, and just understanding the area within those buffers in terms of fire hazard severity and historic wildfire perimeter data. And then using those buffers spatially and temporally to place those sites within a given context and just understand the environment around these sites. Yeah, next slide. So this is the fire hazard severity zone map provided by CAL FIRE. It's a beautiful, gorgeous map. I really like looking at this map. And you can obviously, it's very intuitive if you've lived in California ever. Northern California has very high fire risk almost ubiquitously, and that extends down into the Sierras. You have a nice no risk zone in the valley. Then you have a mix of high, moderate, and very high in the Bay Area. And Southern California is typically just pretty red. And then closer to Nevada, you just have moderate risk because it's mostly desert. So yeah, so with this map, we were able to calculate buffers and calculate the proportion of area around each site within each buffer that was very high risk, and moderate risk. And that information is on the next slide. So this is a very busy graph, but there's a lot of information in there. So I ended up doing a continuous buffer from 0 to 50 kilometers for each site, and it's grouped by cluster. So we have the Sierra, Southern California, Northern California, and the Bay Area, color coded, and then it's classified by moderate, high, and very high risk. And you can kind of see, as the buffers get larger from 0 to 50, the data kind of coalesce a little bit more, and you get some strong groupings involved where when the buffer is really small initially, there's a lot of noise going on there. But the general takeaways here is if you look at like the very high risk column, thank you, Rebecca, the mouse is helpful. So you can see that the Sierras are ubiquitously quite very high risk throughout the extent of the buffer zones. And then Southern California starts out with a whole lot of variability, but generally, if you look at the smooth line, starts out high, gets a little bit smaller. Northern California is rock solid flat line in terms of risk throughout the buffer. And then the Bay Area starts out initially with a high and then descends quite low. So just in general, the Sierras tends to have a whole heck of a lot of very high risk in terms of fire is a takeaway from this map. And to simplify things down on the next slide, I've just isolated a few buffers to kind of look at the variability there. So these are just slices of those buffers. We have 5-kilometer buffers, 25-kilometer buffers, and 50-kilometer buffers. And the proportion of area of those buffers contained within those risks. And the general takeaway is the Bay Area is not is kind of an outlier in terms of doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of area that is very high risk for any of the buffers. The red box plot in the very high risk category is lower than the other clusters across each buffer size. And the Sierras in Southern California start really high initially with the 5-kilometer buffer. And as it gets a little bit bigger, they decrease a little bit. But Northern California is consistently high, consistently very high risk throughout each buffer. So that was that was informative in understanding the risk and the differences in risk between these clusters. All right, next slide. All right, so
sorry, really quick. What this previous graph also shows us, it really starts to show off some of these regional differences that the sites in the Sierras, Northeast and Southern California are really located in some of the highest hazard areas, but the sites in the Bay Area are not really located in areas that even in the surrounding region are in this very high fire hazard severity zone, which might indicate that there's something else that's driving Firewise participation in the Bay Area other than the underlying fire hazard maps. Whereas it seems like the underlying fire hazard maps are really contributing to participation in Firewise within these other 3 areas. Go ahead, Andy.
Thank you very much for making that point. All right. So now that we've kind of understood a little bit of the fire risk around each site within each cluster, the next step was to look at wildfire history around each site. And this is very tricky because history and proximity to wildfire, you're getting into a space-time model there, and that gets really convoluted really quickly. And it's difficult to distill signals through there. But I thought this was a great way to kind of look side by side at proximity to wildfires, their size, and the creation of sites within each cluster. So on this top row, we have the total acres burned within a 50-kilometer radius of each site in the cluster. And then on the bottom row, we have the number of sites established for each year. And what's really interesting about this graph is the Sierras and the Bay Area in particular, they seem to track really well with one another. The total acres burned seems to correlate quite well with the number of sites established. And then in SoCal and Northern California, it's a little bit noisier. Southern California is more or less flat line, and Northern California has an initial spur of site creation and it kind of descends from there. So what this is kind of indicative of, or asks the question of, is the Bay Area and the Sierras kind of just being more responsive to wildfires, or their site creation being a little bit more of a function of their wildfire history within a 50-kilometer radius. All right, next slide. Yeah. So to show that a little bit more, I made the scatter plot to kind of articulate that. And on the x-axis, we have the cumulative acres burned within 50 kilometer of the sites. And then on the y-axis, we have the cumulative number of sites across each year. And it's important to note each point here represents a year. So it goes from 2005 to 2020. And we're comparing 2 cumulative rates here. So we're comparing 2 monotonically increasing functions, right? So there's going to be a lot of correlation going on because they're both increasing at a positive rate. But what's really interesting is where the slopes of those lines diverge between clusters. So we can see, yeah, there we go. So we can see the blue and the red, the Sierras and the Bay Area, they have much more aggressive slopes, meaning that, you know, as more acres burn, the number of sites get created in a given year. And then for Southern California and Northern California, the slopes are much more horizontal. So as you know, the cumulative acres burn goes up, the number of sites doesn't increase as fast of a rate as relative to the Sierras and the Bay Area. So that's really interesting. It's also important to note that you know, the Bay Area and the Sierras are where Firewise sites are most dense as well. So this could be a function of density as well, where populations are just denser and they're more cohesive, and there's just more, there's a lower activation energy to creating new sites in those areas. So I thought this was an interesting plot that kind of showed a divergence of reactivity to wildfires. All right, next slide. All right, so that was the wildfire risk and perimeter history. Now we're kind of going to get into demographics of these Firewise sites. Next slide. So this is a little bit tricky. As I alluded to before, these Firewise sites, all we have is a specific lat long of them. So we don't really have an aerial unit to place them in, which creates a very complicated spatial problem. So to get demographic information and sociodemographic information, I decided to go with the census block group level and use data from the American Community Survey to place those points within a census block group and attribute the census demographics of that block group to the Firewise site. And block group shapefiles are obtained from the Census Tiger database. And yeah, that last point is exactly what I said. We just intersected the Firewise sites on top of those block groups and looked at the characteristics of those specific block groups. All right, so there's going to be a lot of box plots over the next couple slides. So I hope you like box plots. But because, you know, we have a range of years from 2005 to 2020, I thought it was important to pull, you know, American Community Survey data from that length of time to kind of understand if these communities are changing demographically in any specific way. So we have, you know, 2005 to 2009 ACS, 2010 to 2014 ACS, and 2015 to 2019 ACS data. And if we look at the non-white population, it looks pretty consistent from 2005 through 2015 years. Interestingly, though, in 2005 to 2009, Northern California seems to have a slightly higher non-white population, and that tends to decrease over time. But generally, these sites look pretty similar from a demographics perspective. Next slide. If you look at Hispanic population as well, I'm sure you're all aware, the U.S. Census Bureau treats Hispanic ethnicity as an ethnicity, not a race. So, you know, it makes analyzing census data really interesting and complicated. But we can see that all the sites have a similar Hispanic makeup as well, with the most variability coming from Southern California, which would make sense because it's, you know, geographically quite close to large Hispanic communities. So next slide. Next, looking at income, the Census Bureau calculates income as a relative ratio between the poverty level. So, you know, if that ratio is 1, that means you're living at the poverty level. If if that ratio is 1.5, that means you make 1.5 times the poverty level. So this is comparing these site clusters with the proportion of people making over 1.5 times the poverty level. And the takeaway here is that the Bay Area has the highest proportion of people making more than 1.5 times the poverty level. So just generally wealthier. And Northern California is consistently lower across years 2010 to 2015. Next slide. And if we kind of flip the other side of that coin, looking at people living, or the populations living below the poverty line, the same pattern seems to emerge where Northern California seems to have more people living below the poverty line than any other cluster. But again, the variability around these is quite large, right? So, I mean, if you were to do an ANOVA on these things, I'm not sure it would be statistically significant, but it's just interesting to look at and see where these medians fall and these interquartile ranges fall. All right, next slide. And then looking at the proportion of population over 65 years and older, as Rebecca alluded to, these sites tend to be older and whiter, but this was really interesting. There's no distinguishable difference in these site clusters in the proportion of population over 65 years old. It's almost amazing how similar they are in their age makeup. So that was interesting. Next slide. And then lastly, looking at education level, and this kind of mirrors quite well the income data from a few slides previous. The Bay Area is obviously the most educated. It's also the most wealthy. And then Northern California is the least educated. And it was also the least wealthy of the site clusters. And then the Sierras and Southern California are just kind of in the middling range, and they have a lot of variability. Okay, I believe that does it for me.
All right, so I'll wrap it up and then look forward to any questions at the end. So the big takeaways from this research that we've just presented is that there are some really important regional differences among Firewise sites in California. We can't be talking about wildfire preparedness like it's this homogenous thing that every community does in the exact same way. There's actually some really clear indications of differences. So in Southern California, there's a lot of very high fire hazard severity zones. There's a history of large fire, but we have just a not responsive site creation. There just are very, very few Firewise sites in Southern California. I think of the 500, there's maybe 23 or 30 or something in Southern California. So it's just really tiny, particularly considering some of the most severe and large and destructive fires in California have happened very recently in Southern California, like the Thomas Fire and the Woolsey Fire. And yet we just don't see a lot of sites emerging. Let's contrast that with the Bay Area. There's some mixed hazard areas, moderate, high, and very high in the buffer zones, growing buffer zones around these Firewise sites. And there's definitely a history of large fires. But in some ways, there's almost proactive site creation. And I'll just pop back really quickly to this slide right here. This fire year for the Bay Area was 2019. And this was 2020. So we had massive increase in the cumulative acres burned in the area, which increased the number of Firewise sites from 100 to about 150 in a single year. So there's a huge increase following some of these major sites. But there's a lag time between when the site decides that they're going to become a Firewise site and then when they get the application in and when they get approved. And meanwhile, wildfire seasons are all happening. So there's actually potentially some indication that here, and we're going to do some more seasonality research on this, but there may be an indication that the Bay Area, in response to some of the more recent fires, is now taking more proactive steps to prepare for wildfires by creating Firewise sites, whereas other places are more responsive. And we see that the trend line is more responsive. So for example, responsive is more like the Sierras. Very high fire hazard areas throughout this region. There's a history of large fires nearby, and the sites are responding, in response to these fires. We're seeing a big increase in the number of Firewise sites in response to the underlying fire hazard and also the fires themselves. And then there's Northern California, where we see very high fire hazard, history of large fires, but again, not that many sites, more than Southern California, but it's still not got the explosion of Firewise sites that we see in the Bay Area and the Sierras. And then in terms of demographics, a number of the trends that we saw fairly consistent between the Bay Area, Sierras, and Southern California. As Andy mentioned, the Bay Area is more highly educated and also wealthier than the other two regions, but Northern California is a little bit more of an outlier. less wealthy, and less educated, again, in the census blocks where those Firewise sites are located. But I mentioned all the way at the beginning that these Firewise sites can range from 8 to 2,500 homes. It's totally conceivable that the 8 people living in those 8 homes in a particular site are over 65 or extremely wealthy, or might be way different than what the underlying census block data might represent. So we do have to bear that in mind. But at least in terms of the general characteristics of the region itself, not a ton of differences that we see. And I also want to note something that I mentioned way at the beginning, which was that a lot of these Firewise sites were really emphasizing education rather than mitigation. And that can actually potentially limit the value of these Firewise sites. There's no real expectation from the NFPA that these Firewise sites are going to do much necessarily to actually reduce their wildfire risk. And though we've seen that sites that are really active, like in that example I gave you of Durango, where they protected their community, their whole town by being Firewise sites, if you're not being super actively engaged in fire mitigation, it may just be a sign that you get to put in front of your community saying that we are a Firewise site. So it's really important to not just have education to teach residents about wildfire mitigation habits and evacuations, but also to put that into practice to really reduce those overarching risks for the community. But we still are working on this research, so we'd be happy to take any recommendations or thoughts that you might have. One of the things that we're going to be looking at in the future is this domino effect that Andy was describing earlier, essentially clustering. How does proximity to existing Firewise sites influence the creation of a new Firewise site? In places like Marin County, which have more Firewise sites than any other county in the entire country, everybody's talking about Firewise. And so if you go to learn anything about wildfire preparedness, people are going to be throwing Firewise material at you. Well, that's a very different thing than you might be seeing in Southern California, where we see far fewer sites and they're much more spread out. So one of the things we want to look at is that proximity. And then the other thing, kind of building on that density question, is the 2 highest density clusters of Firewise sites are the Sierras and the Bay Area, and they're very, very responsive to fires. Whereas that low density clusters of Southern California and Northern California are the least responsive. Now, understanding why that might be the case may not be something that we can answer with this research, but it might be useful to do interviews or surveys, particularly with groups like fire safe councils or local fire departments, to better understand what's not driving participation in those lower density clusters and what is driving participation in those higher density clusters. And then way beyond what we're looking at here by just focusing in California is thinking about these regional trends across the whole country. How do Firewise trends vary in the Midwest, the Southwest, the Southeast? Again, there are Firewise sites all over the country, but fire risk looks really different in Virginia than in Wisconsin than in California. And we might be seeing really interesting different trends as communities across the country are responding to their own localized fire risk in really different ways than we're seeing even regionally within California. And so with that, we'd love to chat and discuss this research with more details. And thanks so much for the chance to present our ongoing work.
Well, Rebecca and Andy, thank you for just a compelling talk. Taught me several things. I have a lot of questions, but I'll save mine for the end if people don't have any. But a lot of great work that you guys are doing, and a lot of, I think, unanswered questions that I hope you guys will figure out in the days ahead. So I'll open the floor to questions from the audience.
I don't know, Derek, you might be the only one with questions.
I think I have enough here. Felicity, please go ahead.
Oh, you're muted, Felicity.
Great to see you again, Rebecca.
Hi, so good to see you.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It was a general, this is going to be a crazy analogy, but Firewise protections, home hardening, everything out there that is part of the Firewise program are sort of crucial to keeping communities safer. Mm-hmm. My analogy is to vaccination. Is there any thought of any sort of pushing communities to do this? Not requiring, not mandating, but pushing, either through insurance company rebates or government, something sort of create a positive atmosphere around this, because I think, I mean, I lived in Portola Valley, and we are very conscious of fire, or I've moved out since, and I know that there's at least one Firewise community in Woodside, but it's, preaching to the choir. We had the CZU fire, it came close. When you're not preaching to the choir, how can you spread this? And is there any incentive that you can think of that might work?
So the insurance piece, I think, is huge. The fact that about 40% of homeowners insurance in California, I want to say, could be covered in like you'd get a discount, I think, with a Firewise site, based on what I saw at the California Department of Insurance. That's a really big incentive, because it's essentially saying, here's money back in your pocket, or you can get a discount. And especially when wildfire insurance is practically impossible to get in California right now, having that definitely helps. And it looks like David might have just added that to the link, which is great. But one of the things that Firewise, in terms of how NFPA views it, is that it's this voluntary approach. Like, there's not going to be, they're going to push it out there and they're going to encourage people to do it, but there isn't it's never, as they plan to do it, going to have some sort of a mandate associated with it. But I think that you're absolutely right about that preaching to the choir, which is sort of what we want to see with this domino effect of, is that the reason why Southern California has so few sites, because there just aren't that many anyway. So people aren't talking about it. So people aren't talking about their fire risk. Whereas in the Bay Area and the Sierras, it's like all people are talking about right now, especially because insurance is coming into play so seriously. And I mean, if anybody could get access to insurance data, it might be really interesting to see, how homeowners losing their insurance might be influencing as well Firewise site creation in a lot of these areas.
It might also be great to see what discounts, basically who's applied for the discounts and how much money has been saved in Firewise areas.
So USAA will give a 10% discount, and I think that that's fairly standard, but it's more the guarantee that you won't get dropped that I think is compelling to people. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great question. I guess Jill took her hand down, but she did put something in the comment, and I'll piggyback on it because it was part of my question. She was asking about the insurance question. Has any analysis been done in terms of what insurance companies do to set the discounts? They just in a boardroom and say 10% is a good discount to get people to do Firewise? Because
the work with USAA, I know, was done in conjunction with NFPA. So
okay.
I believe that was a national negotiation, and NFPA, I believe, is also in communication with other major homeowners insurance companies to make those discounts available. My understanding in the California context for those places that are offering discounts is that USAA is really the big one that's offering a Firewise discount, and a lot of the other ones are much smaller insurance companies generally.
It seems like a pretty good carrot, although I guess I'm going to let Mark go, because I said I can talk with you offline. I have a lot of questions related to that, but Mark, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I appreciate your discussion here. Very informative. I should confess that I do a lot of work with insurance companies.
Oh, well, we should be asking you all these questions then.
So, but the question I wanted to ask is, have you looked at more detailed geography around where Firewise communities lie in relation to to the non-Firewise communities? So, for example, that's the view from the wall behind my head. I live in Northwest Montana and conveniently get to work for Stanford. But I live in a Firewise community, and the only Firewise communities here are on the edges of the towns. And what happens in some respect is the Firewise communities that are more in the wooey than like the downtown, they will put it's almost like a ring around the non-Firewise communities. So for example, to the north of me is a very, very large Firewise community. And the one I'm in and one other, those three private homeowners associations essentially protect the city of Whitefish, Montana. And I'm curious if like that's an odd observation by where I am, or if you see that across California.
So I'll let Andy actually answer the geography piece of this, but my guess is that because they're points, it's probably pretty hard to tell where they're located.
Yeah.
But I think that what you're saying does come into play with the Bay Area that we see, because when we see that mixed fire hazard severity zones where it's like a third in moderate and a third in high and a third in very high compared to 75% of the buffer around these sites in the other locations is very high fire hazard severity zones. I think that that comes into play on those are often going to be in more urban areas that might technically be in the WUI, but are really more not in what we would traditionally think of as the WUI. And it's a reaction to seeing things like the Sonoma fires, where they burned through an area that wasn't technically the WUI, but it was a suburban community with significant damage associated with it. And so my gut says that you're right in other regions, but the Bay Area, I think, is an exception where they're really focusing on actually non-WUI areas. And I think that that's coming into play with the distribution of the fire hazard. But I'll defer to Andy on the actual geography point there.
No, yeah, all really good points. So yeah, wildlife urban interface is, there are data out there, and that is something we could look at in the future, is to see, where these points fall on the wildlife urban interfaces. Also, I mean, I read a paper recently that did some really good work with a digital surface model and really placing topography and vegetative context around points. So yeah, those would all be really great things to look into the future. I mean, believe it or not, it still feels like, we're at the exploratory phase of this. It's this data is a bit like an onion of, we have these questions. There's all these publicly available data sets that we can kind of overlay and gain context around. And yeah, really good points.
That's great.
Thanks for the
Thanks.
question.
Let me just one quick comment is the 10% discount is, I'm sure there's no thought into USA as 10% discount. I can almost guarantee you there's no thought into it. And there has been, and I'm happy to discuss this offline with you, there has been some work by a couple of reinsurance players to actually figure out if you are having any impact on wildfire risk through this activity. I think topography and fuel loads are so important. Where there's some places where the topography means you almost can't do anything unless you're going to cut down all the trees. Other places where I think it matters. So I think it's very location specific.
Well, I would love to talk to you about insurance, because anybody who can open the window on that is very valuable. So yes, all right, please reach out.
Thanks.
Yeah, I should talk to you too, Mark, for a hackathon. But yeah, that's a great point. David, do you have a question? I see your hand up. Thanks for waiting.
You bet. And first, thanks for letting kind of an outsider jump in on this. Super interesting as a practitioner. So in Placer County, we have the largest number of structures in the state responsibility area and high severity hazard area. I think we're number 2 in the nation right now in terms of county with the number of Firewise communities. We actually support that through a contracted paid position, which I think is what's driven a lot of our success. But this is really interesting to me because, as the person who has to, decide where to spend the funds, is this the biggest bang for the buck? I guess it's something to throw out, at least for California, with AB 38 and the defensible space regulations. We have been kind of kicking around the concept. You mentioned that Firewise was more of an educational kind of an instrument, because we're not having a lot of success in people actually doing work necessarily to be part of Firewise. But, is there a way to marry these two up so that, when people have to do a 4291 inspection to sell their home or to try to get insurance for that, do we get better compliance if they're in a Firewise community? That's so just something for you to think about. Also to let you know, we're actually mapping our Firewise communities on a parcel level. So if you ever want to get down in the weeds, or you want to get access to Firewise communities to chat with or that, we would love to have you come in and do that, because this is fascinating, and somehow we got to crack this nut in the state. So,
Well, I will just respond very quickly about the compliance question or the comment. Actually, I've just been finishing up a report totally separate from this, but also for NFPA, looking at this pilot program that they did on the sites of excellence. So they found 7 Firewise sites across the country, none in California though, and challenged them to focus on the home ignition zone within their communities over a 2-year period, and they gave them $2,000. And I did a post game analysis of how it went for NFPA. And one of the things that I heard almost unanimously was the interest from the Firewise sites for having more accountability, more goals, higher standards. And so there may be in the future, maybe some sort of multi-tiered Firewise site coming out, so that it's not just, oh, you do, the bare minimum, you're a Firewise site, but you're actually working on the home ignition zone, and you're taking active steps, and you're doing chipper days, and to be, a higher level of Firewise site. The way that they called them, the pilot was the sites of excellence, and that pilot did end at the end of 2020. But NFPA is thinking hard about how to expand something like that or make it a more permanent option. So there may be something for you there at some point.
Rebecca, that's really insightful, because I guess one of the questions I've been jotting down was like education versus actually taking action, and if I were an insurance company, right, education is one thing, but if you don't do anything with it, what's the benefit? So that sounds like an interesting direction. One of the things that you ended, your slides on, which I'm hoping is sort of the path to success, is really understanding participation. And we actually have in the chat here, Bill was asking, he said it appears a high-risk location like Paradise doesn't have any Firewise sites. And is that really true? And if so, do you have any insights as to why that might be the case? Because I think, to me, the big question is the word not getting out there? Why aren't there more Firewise sites? And I think you're right. It's going to be maybe a momentum building experiment. But do you have any thoughts on Paradise?
I don't know if Paradise has any Firewise sites. I believe that you're right. Andy, do you know off the top of your head?
No.
Okay, but I tried looking this up before once, and
I'm looking at your map, and it shows the nearest one is up in Vigalia, which is a pretty different place.
Yes. Okay. We don't, unfortunately. And part of what I wish that we could do more with this research is do a little bit more counterfactual. Like where should a Firewise site be located, or what are the factors that are not convincing somebody to participate in Firewise? And I think that ultimately comes back to what I was saying before about talking to, expanding this work by doing interviews and surveys in places to understand why are you not doing this, and not just why are you doing this. I think there's a ton of research, and it's stuff that I mentioned at the very beginning about disposable income and belief that structure mitigation works, that are all compelling people to engage in fire mitigation work, but we don't have a lot of evidence or to indicate what's making people choose not to do that beyond just the opposite, like, oh, I just don't believe that it works. Well, I don't think that people in Paradise didn't believe that wildfire mitigation worked. There were probably other factors in play for why they didn't join Firewise. And maybe that was the fact that maybe their local fire safe council didn't talk about it, or maybe the local fire department didn't talk about it, because those are the 2 primary areas that compel people to participate in the program. But again, that gets into, I think, more research on why things are not happening, rather than what I've seen primarily emphasized, which is why things do happen.
I guess, Rebecca, to that question though, how well is Firewise known? I mean, to not the community or individual homeowner, but to local fire councils, local fire departments, county fire. Is it out there? Like, if I were a particular county X, am I aware of that at least, or do we even know the answer to that question?
I mean, we don't necessarily know the answer to that question, which again is part of the problem. And it also might explain, like, why is Southern California so badly depicted here. You would imagine to have a lot more Firewise sites down there, but there just aren't. And I just don't know whether that's because the fire safe councils down there don't talk about it. Some of the fire safe councils are covering, many, many counties. Now, that could mean that they're spreading the word in many counties, or it means that if they aren't, really engaged with Firewise, then many counties are not going to be engaged with Firewise. But again, I think that comes down to getting a better sense of what the understanding of those programs is at different places. And I think really focusing on those regional differences will give us a better picture of what's missing there.
Great. Bill, did you have any more comments or questions?
Well, I'm just curious. I think I've mentioned before, my family's been in Paradise since the 1960s, and we've never heard of Firewise.
Interesting.
I had like 100
my
relatives
gosh.
up there, and my cousin fought in Cal Fire. So
Wow. I mean, the
and
program's only been around since 2005, but I'm still pretty shocked to hear that.
yeah.
Wow.
And I think it'd be really interesting. I would just maybe suggest actually interviewing people in areas like that, because I don't even know that I think you might have hit on something. I'm not even sure they think that what they do around their house is going to make much difference, because it's the ecosystem of the environment. I mean, you've got tens of thousands of pine trees, and the fire pops along the top of them. Once you cut all your pine trees down, I don't know what you could. It would be really interesting to talk to some people that in environments where they've been through this. Just a thought.
I think it's a great idea. I really do.
All right, thanks. Sorry.
We have time for one more question. We're almost at 1:15. Anyone else have a question? Okay, I'll leave it at that. Like, my questions will take too long, but I will contact you, Rebecca.
Okay,
Thanks
sounds great.
to Andy and Rebecca for just a really compelling talk and presentation, as well as another great discussion. And I just encourage you to come back one more time next week. We're going to be talking about Stanford's wildfire plan. So you want to think about our own backyard, at least for our fair university. Come back next week, and we'll actually have a panel representing some consultants, as well as the Stanford land use folks, talking about what Stanford's doing to look about what's going on in our own backyard. Thanks again, Rebecca and Andy. Thank you everyone for their questions and attention. We'll see you again next week. Take
Thanks
care.
for having us.
Bye.